There are many things that you can do with swim lanes in BPMN, and this is not one of them. Hi, my name is Andreas Sense and I make videos in business process automation. Today I'll talk about swim lanes in BPMN. Let's first talk about what you actually can do with swim lanes. According to the BPMN specification, swim lanes are there to partition sets of activities according to some principle, and it's not very specific about what the principle should be, and this is up to the programmer, as the specification says, or up to the modeler, as the specification says. And there are some examples mentioned in the BPMN specification. For example, you can have different roles in different swim lanes. This is actually something that I see most of the time. You can have organizational units. You can also have swim lanes for IT systems. So you can make explicit when an IT system is doing some activity and have their own swim lane for that. So there are many possibilities. One way of modeling a process would be to say that the finance department is working there, so you have a clerk there working, and the clerk gets a swim lane in the finance department, and the IT system, the accounting system, gets its own swim lane, and then you would have all the automated tasks that are done with the accounting system in one swim lane and the rest in the swim lane for the clerk. Another way of doing this would be to put all of these activities into one swim lane and then have other departments or other roles outside of the accounting department. So it really depends on what you want to do. You could even use individual names and say, okay, one swim lane is for Bob and one is for Jill, etc. But this is very unusual and something that doesn't appear too often in business processes. So this is what you can do in swim lanes. What are things that are difficult to do with swim lanes? If you want to have more than one role in a swim lane, for example, or more than one role for a task, then you cannot put the task just on top of two adjacent swim lanes. This is forbidden actually in the BPMN specification. And the only thing that you could do is to create some kind of a combined swim lane for two roles or a combination of roles. Of course, this doesn't scale up very well. Another thing, by the way, if you look at tool support for swim lanes, for example, if you look at the Camunda modeler, putting a task in a swim lane doesn't have any effect on the process automation. So putting it in a swim lane for finance, for example, doesn't mean that the task will be offered to finance later on. This is something I think it's a wise decision in Camunda to implement it that way, but it's just to show you that swim lanes are there to visualize things, but they are not necessarily, I mean, what's being done underneath doesn't necessarily correspond to the swim lanes. Another thing is that besides swim lanes, there is the concept of pools. So what's the difference between a pool and a swim lane? A swim lane is there for different roles or different organizational units in the same organization. So as long as a business process is inside one organization, it's usually represented with one pool and several swim lanes. If you have two tasks, for example, a sequence of tasks between different swim lanes, you would connect them just with a simple sequence flow. Whereas if you connect tasks between different pools, you would connect them with a message flow. The tools like the Camunda modeler, for example, they make sure that you cannot use the wrong connection here between different tasks. You would use different pools if you have, for example, a business process that is overarching. So, for example, if you have two different organizations like a supply chain management process, you would use one business process for one organization. You would use one pool for one organization and the other pool for the other organization. What you can also do is, if you have a customer, for example, because the customer doesn't belong to the organization, that you just have a pool for the customer. Very often this is a collapsed pool, and then that you have an expanded pool with all the details and many swim lanes for the organization itself. So now that we have seen what you can do and what we cannot do with swim lanes, let's talk about the pros and cons of swim lanes. One of the good things about swim lanes is that they make explicit if there is a handover in a business process between different organizational units, between different roles, etc. And if you have many handovers in a business process, this can always lead to problems. So swim lanes make this problem visible. A disadvantage of swim lanes is that they need a lot of space. So, for example, if you have a business process consisting of many tasks, and let's say they just go between 3 different swim lanes, then you would have a lot of empty space there. Or if you have a swim lane just for one task and you would just have to use all this horizontal space for just one task in the business process, this takes up a lot of space, and the tendency of BPMN diagrams becoming very large is quite high. And I've seen that many times in practice, that BPMN diagrams were presented that were far too large for a monitor, far too large to display on a projector, etc. And then people, used to cut these diagrams in different slices, and that really became unreadable. So space is really a concern here when you are modeling business processes, and you shouldn't rely on a big wall with a huge piece of paper where you can print your business process. This, in many cases, is not what you're looking for. So you're really looking for a way of representing your business process somewhere on a screen, let's say of medium size, something like that. What alternatives are there to swim lanes? Yeah, one alternative are EPCs, or event-driven process chains. There you have these functions that are the same thing as task in BPMN, and you can actually attach elliptical elements to these tasks that represent resources, and usually they're colored yellow, so it's easy to recognize them. A nice thing about the solution in EPCs and in tools like the ARIS toolset, for example, is that you can actually have your standard representation of an EPC with these organizational units attached, and you can transform it automatically into a swim lane view. So the tool is actually creating the swim lane view from another view. I think that's very elegant. Another alternative to swim lanes is something that we have implemented in YAWL. In YAWL we have used an algorithm behind the scenes that evaluates the roles that are being used in tasks. And then these tasks are colored according to the role. So each role has a unique color that is generated automatically. And then also the problem that you can offer a task to more than one role is solved by just having very colorful tasks with many stripes in the extreme case. Yeah, so I think swim lanes are only one way of showing resources in business processes, and there are alternatives, and I think swim lanes shouldn't be the only way of showing roles and responsibilities. What's your take on this? I would be interested to know what you think, your experience with BPMN or other modeling languages. Just write me a comment. Thank you for watching.